I called your Aunt Neela as your grandmother was passing, and they spoke for hours. My mother smiled with pride. My Aunt Neela had not spoken to my grandmother in a decade, and I truly resented that she got to say goodbye before me. For my mother, because I was not talking to her, she could not reach out to me. Yet as she progressed in her story, I realized half of Puerto Rico was contacted. There were like 50 people there every day. We had a group of nuns and a priest visit. All my high school friends came, even Angie, who I hadn't spoken to in years, came from San Juan. My mother grieved and gloated. I smiled with tears in my eyes, but my brain wrapped in confusion. How were so many people there and contacted, and I was not? As she continued to describe how even cousins who stopped speaking to her came to speak to my grandmother, I swore that at one point she named my grandmother's deathbed as a tour stop for Bad Bunny. After 3 hours of my mother crying inconsolably, I smiled and hung up. But the next few days I felt frozen by the reality that not even a letter or a pigeon was sent to tell me I was still calling a number that would never pick up again. Hers. All right, let's heal. Let's discuss, yeah. So my mother, I'm not the quickest processor. And I don't know if that's, trauma brain or just I grew up in a family that could stab you and then gaslight you into believing you either stabbed yourself or you weren't bleeding or, they were so instantly cruel and then, but at the same time, instantly covering it up. By the time you realized that person hit me, they were already planning brunch or Christmas vacation. It was very hard to process bad things and betrayals because there was such a hyper focus on looking good and having fun. And if you felt bad, that was on you. And that's something you had to personally work on. So when I called my mother to find out what was going on with my grandmother, she told me she had passed and then started describing how she passed. And it was a very weird conversation because I was oddly peaceful and my mother was inconsolable. And I think there was an element of shock and just part of why I avoided my mother was because when she would have breakdowns, I would do everything to be strong for her. And I think there was a little bit of me going back to who I was. Like, if my mother was crying, I would try not to cry or outcry her because she was so emotionally big and volatile. And I think as a witness to her life, I saw this person go through so many tragedies and really struggle to cry that when she did cry, I just wanted to hold her because she needed to. The flip side of that is my mother would only cry if I felt she had made me cry. And it's almost like she only felt when she had to outfeel me. And there was this part of me that I just can't believe I never got to say goodbye to my grandmother. And I can't believe that my mother's selfishness won again. Because my mother has always been very self-centered with me. But I didn't mind it or didn't see it because I still wanted her in my life and I wanted her to be a center in my life. And a lot of our relationship crumbled because I stopped working so hard for it and started to focus more on working on myself because I didn't love me. And my mother was very hateful towards me. But part of how I maintained the relationship was telling myself, my mother is hateful, but she doesn't hate me. My mother can sabotage me, but it's because she doesn't know better. And something about hearing that half of Puerto Rico came to my grandmother's deathbed and not one person could text me shocked me. Because my mother, when I went no contact with my mother, it was because she was always rage texting me, the internet is out, the phone bill, like all her. My mother, near the end of our relationship, my mother just completely handed to me all her issues and all her negative feelings. And we lost our fun. And in a way it's good because that was the trickiness of my mother and I's relationship. It was fun and then incredibly dark and toxic. It was filled with laughs and then a lot of verbal and mental, emotional, and even physical abuse towards me. And when I said I don't like that or I don't think that's good, that's when it would really crumble. But it had gotten to a point where it was just only abusive and all I was doing was saying I don't like it and there were no more laughs. There was no veil anymore. It was just this person is cruel towards me and that's all I talk about. Like it even became the main topic with my friends. My mother is cruel to me. And I hated that was her cruelty was the center of my world. And it was such a center in how I moved through life near the end of our relationship. And I hated that that's how I was centering her. So part of why I went no contact with her was almost just to save myself enough to see if we could ever repair, because she had depleted me so much mentally, emotionally, financially, that there was this part of me that, because I always told myself my mother has a lot of issues, I forgave her for becoming mine and dumping all of hers on me. And I didn't actually take the time to analyze that she was doing that on purpose, that she wanted to hurt me and call it love. And she was raised that way. Most of her family had that dynamic in terms of parent-child. My father was certainly that way. But I never thought in a million gazillion years that there was a scenario where I wasn't holding my grandmother's hand as she passed. And I had gotten a feeling that her passing would come sooner than later because of going no contact with my mother. And this is where my guilt comes in, and I don't know how to feel. I was talking less to my grandmother, in part because she became really obsessed with talking about how I didn't talk to my mom. And I didn't know how to handle that trigger because I couldn't believe that my mother's relationship with me had gotten so dark that I had to leave. I couldn't believe that I was leaving for good. But I knew I needed the mental and emotional space to process how vicious my mother was towards me before I could ever consider. It's almost like before I could even consider being with her, I had to learn how to be myself again and figure out what that meant and who that was. And I loved my grandmother. So when she would bring up my mother not talking to my mother, there was a part of me that felt really, really bad because I loved that woman. I would have done anything to please her except that. And it was really because I had no pleasure with my mom. Everything was dark. Even going out to dinner was a discussion about how everything was expensive and nothing tasted good and the weather is off and my friend is cheating and I heard this gossip about like politics and everything was so negative. And then it would be negative towards me. You chew loud. You breathe hard. You're so dirty. You are like a pig. And it just, I couldn't see that there wasn't a connection between how my mother lived and how I lived. Alone, not struggling to find a social circle, struggling to find financial stability. Like became a mirror of her life. And I'm young. And I just needed time to figure out me for once, because my entire life was putting the both of them first. And I didn't mind it because me and my grandmother were very similar. And my mother was cruel, but she was also incredibly funny. And there just came a point where she stopped being funny with me. And she demanded me to still make her laugh. You know, because that was the thing. She could get darker with me. I had to get lighter. And finding out that all these people that my mother would complain didn't show up for me, stopped talking to her, like stop talking to me, stop talking to your grandma. Even they got contacted to say goodbye. And there's a part of me that's like, I could see where my mother, grief. I'm sure my mother was going crazy those few days. But she was so gabby about how we weren't talking. Why couldn't she tell somebody to talk to me? And she doesn't talk about how I don't talk to her in a way of like, can somebody give me advice how to heal this? She talks about me in a way that I am a deeply ungrateful villain. And this was a moment where she really had to push aside how she saw me as a daughter, because nobody could argue against me as a granddaughter. Me and my grandmother were tight. We loved each other. My mother could barely get through 2 minutes of a conversation with my grandmother. I could speak to her for 2 hours about everything. I do wish my grandmother had told me more stories about her growing up, because that's what I really wanted. But she always said, one day. And that's my big regret. Like, maybe I could have pressured her more. But I also understood my grandmother had a really painful life. She was raised in poverty. The U.S. has always been racist towards Puerto Rico. And her time in the U.S. was very, very hard. She would tell me, that she cried a lot and she cried every day. And then you add on that my grandfather was a horrible person towards her. And my mother and her had a complicated relationship because they were so different in personalities. And my mom had her own traumas too. So for my mother to kind of take how we weren't getting along as a sign or as an excuse to say me and my grandmother wasn't, it feels very hypocritical, because she even called my Aunt Nila, who wasn't talking to my grandmother, hadn't talked to her for a decade. My mother continued talking to her. And I stopped because I thought to myself, I felt there was something off about my Aunt Nila. And I also felt there's something off about me talking to somebody who doesn't talk to the only real connection we have, which was my grandmother. And she even got a phone call goodbye. And it's there's the old version of me that wants to say, well, I stopped talking to my mom and I blocked her rage emails. I knew there could be an emergency. And I did when I blocked my mother's emails, because I had already blocked her phone. I did tell myself, Deandra or Hadeen, check out all music platforms, you have to accept that, like, if something happens, you might not get contacted and you might not get, like, be a participant in it, because so many of my family's emergencies, I was the main contact and the main resolver. But I was in a space where I just couldn't give anymore. I really had to give to me. And because my mother was rage texting me and always kind of, my mother weaponized health as a way to control my behavior. Like, if I told her I didn't like what she called me, she would say she had a headache. And because she was actually a sickly person, I did respect that. But there came a point, especially near the end of our relationship, where it was like, you know, it's not by chance that every time I say, I don't like that you throw out my stuff or you look through it, you suddenly have a chest pain. And there was a part of me, because I was so addicted to my mother and so craving of her affection, that kind of wanted to believe her excuse, you blocked me. But then her entire story was about how she contacted, like, even the alcalde of Puerto Rico, like, everybody was contacted. I think Rao Alejandro showed up at one point. Like, everybody, Evie Queen, like, it was like every famous Puerto Rican, Lin Manuel Miranda was like everybody. It's almost like I couldn't ignore how much effort she put in to surround myself, to surround my grandmother with people that had, even people that had isolated her from their life. And she couldn't manage to contact the one person she called her life, aka me. And I'm crossed, because I know that I have my own culpability. But part of the moves I made was in reaction to the moves my mother made. And my mother acts like she never made a move against me. But to call someone every day complaining about your life and never having compassion for their own struggles, like, my mother thought my life was perfect. And she doesn't even know the name of my best friend. And the name of my best friend was my grandma. Going no contact, it really is a contract that you are walking away from people's lives. And that you might miss really big events. But it's also a contract with your mental health and with finally choosing you, and you first for once. And I hated that I was raised in a family that made me have to choose that. Either I love myself or I love them. And I regret in some ways that I couldn't be there for my grandmother, or I didn't show up for as much as I wanted to. But I also don't regret how much I've grown, how much I've worked on me, how much I'm even trying to love me. And I hate that the cost in many ways was my mother. Not just losing my mother, but losing my grandmother. Check out DeAndreWiesel.com for some daddy recovery articles. Check out Hadeen, my artist name, on all music platforms, and let's heal. Let's heal.